This is an exhibit, the annual exhibit of the Lee Historical Society. And this year we're doing the 1950s. And we've entitled our exhibit Happy Days, Lee in the 1950s, borrowing the title Happy Days from the television program on the 1950s. We'd like to thank you for coming today, Joe, and CTSB, and thank the Lee Public Library for allowing us to use this space for the exhibit. So we will proceed through the decade of the 1950s, talking about what was going on nationally, about all of the exciting things that were going on in that decade, and then talking about what was happening in Lee during the 1950s. And it's an era, a decade actually, of particular interest. Some people consider it to be a decade of sort of mindless self-indulgence. It was the post-war period. People were celebrating and having a good time. But at the same time, it was a decade of extreme seriousness. It was a decade in which the threat of nuclear war hung over our heads. And people were twirling their hula hoops, but at the same time possibly fearing nuclear war, polio, and other issues and problems that existed during the decade. So it's a pretty interesting decade, and we wanted to see what was going on in Lee during that particular time. So if we could move along to the year 1950. Okay, what was going on in 1950 nationally? We have, for each of these years, we have that #1 hit song, the best film of that year, any particular connections to Lee between what was going on nationally, and also other information about hit songs and pop culture of the 1950s. And it was a decade in which the Korean War began. We went from World War II, when we were just barely starting to celebrate the victory in World War II, when the Korean War broke out. And unfortunately, two of the Lee veterans, the Lee military people from the Korean War, never came home. They died during the war. Just as an example of a local connection, the Milton Berle Texaco Star Theater was the #1 television show of that particular era. And Milton Berle had a close connection to the Berkshires. He used to spend time away from New York City and away from television at the Dream Away Lodge in Beckett, one of his favorite places to come. So it's an interesting local connection. And now on to 1950, and a real irony, because when I started researching this, the first story that I came to, the very first story, was clean up the river. Well, that's also the #1 story today in Lee and in the Berkshires. Of course, the river was not, that's long before we heard of PCBs, but the river in that particular era was filled with industrial and human waste. There were no sewage treatment plants, and the river was really a real mess. And what they had decided to do, the town appropriated $1,000 for what they called a trunk line. And the trunk line was simply a pipe that would go into the river up in the general vicinity of the Eagle Mill Dam, and solids would be diverted into the pipe and down through the pipe, and it would go down as far as the South End Bridge, the Park Street Bridge, and then be dumped back into the river again. They weren't really solving anything. They were just getting it past downtown. So that's a pretty good example of story from the 1950s that was really a theme from that particular era. We also have some pictures. One of our main sources here for this particular exhibit is high school yearbooks. And interesting, if you look at the high school yearbooks, these pictures from the various years in the 1950s, and you kind of get an idea of what this particular period was like. You notice that all of the people who were in speech class were boys, and all of the people who were in typing and home ec classes were girls. So there was a definite stereotyping here of roles, and girls were assigned certain roles, and they did not get into areas that might involve politics or that type of thing through speech class. And if you notice the picture of the faculty here, very formal, all of the men in jackets and ties, all of the women in very tasteful dresses and so on. And interesting, too, that you note, if you look at the names down below, that the women were known not by their own first names, but by their husbands' names. So, for example, I see, let's see, I'm looking for one of the married women, Mrs. Frances G. Fanning. Frances was her husband's name, not hers. So also in the 1960s, we see the wonders of modern medicine. And that is that in the early days of Lee, infant mortality had been a chronic problem and an alarming problem, a huge number of children who died in infancy. And by the 1950s, this had been eradicated, largely due to the work of some very trusted physicians who were here in Lee, and the great work that they did in almost completely eliminating infancy, death at infancy. Of 57 births in Lee in 1950, only 2 died in infancy. And that was pretty outstanding compared to what they had in previous decades. Right. We see the year 1951 here in colorful pink and white here. The #1 TV program of the era, Arthur Godfrey's Talent Scouts. And the top song of the year was Too Young by Nat King Cole. And there's a Lee connection again there because following the death of Nat King Cole, who died very untimely death very early in life, I think he was only in his 40s, but his wife, Maria Cole, and her family came to the Berkshires to live. She purchased Morgan House Inn and owned and operated Morgan House Inn for several years while the family lived in Terringham. So we got a direct connection there to Lee. And another seismic event of 1951 was the invention of the birth control pill, which really revolutionized society in many ways. And so an interesting development. It didn't really go into use right away, but it was in testing at that point in 1951. And we think of the 1950s as being a really carefree era in which it was a great time to raise children. But again, we see repression of girls. And we see this especially here through basketball. Girls, as you can see from these photographs, girls played in sort of primitive-looking uniforms that looked like bloomers or something. Boys' sports were glorified beyond belief. There was pre-sale of tickets to basketball games. Many of the basketball games played to sold-out crowds. There was much in the newspaper about boys' sports, very little about girls' sports. They played in anonymity. And to give you an idea of the way people thought of girls at that particular time, their rules, girls were not considered to be capable of running the full length of the basketball court, so that there would be 3 players in the front zone of the basketball court and 3 in the back zone, 3 offensive players, 3 defensive, and the girls could not cross the center line. That was the rules that they played under. Also, they were permitted no more than 2 dribbles. I guess they thought that girls weren't capable of dribbling the basketball more than twice. So very repressive in their attitudes and very much glorifying boys' sports. Fine to glorify sports, but why not glorify both? Because we found out that women can play a sport like basketball at a very high level, even a professional level. Lee was getting a more modern look in the 1950s. Interestingly, if you had come to Lee in the before 1951, you would have found as you drove out or away from the center of town, you would have found a lot of gravel roads. A lot of the roads were still unsurfaced. And in 1951, the town began a really aggressive program of surfacing roads. And we have here a list of the many streets and roads that were being upgraded in 1951. And these were all around the town, all of the secondary roads around the town. We also have an ad here from the Lee Theater. This was one of the main features of the town in the 1950s, the movie theater that was on Main Street, which is no longer stands. It went out of business in the 1970s. And but in the 1950s, it was a big deal in town to have our own Main Street movie theater. And so that's about it for 1950. That kind of gives you an overview. There's much more to be seen, so we hope everybody will come to the exhibit if they can and see what else was going on during this era. 52. Now here's a television program that became a real blockbuster. The #1 TV program of this particular year, 1952, was I Love Lucy. And that show, a very funny show with Lucille Ball, a very funny comedian, that show remained on top for several years. So also we find the best film, The Greatest Show on Earth, starred James Stewart. And we always like to tell the story about James Stewart's connection to Lee. A World War II flyer from Lee by the name of Willard Pease actually served in the 8th Air Force in Europe during World War II, and his commanding officer was Jimmy Stewart, the actor. And both of those gentlemen remained in the service. Stewart became a general in the Air Force Reserve, and Pease became a colonel. Willard Pease of Lee became a colonel in the Air Force Reserve. And we move along to what was going on in Lee during the 1950s. We have an interesting thing here that it was very inexpensive to have a child. It was a time when society was growing, and it was a time to build, as we say here. And part of that would be that it was very inexpensive to have a child in 1952. You could get a deluxe private room for $23 a day in 1952, and the child would stay, the baby would stay in the hospital for $6 a day, and the average cost of the same services in 2023 was estimated at $18,865 by the Peterson Kaiser Foundation. Of course, people have much higher incomes today, and we'll have more on income as we move along. Now, what else was going on in 52 was there had been much talk since 1948 about a major east-west road in Massachusetts, which would be known as the east-west, it was initially known as the east-west toll highway, or the Western Highway, sometimes called. And by 1952, people had heard this talk for a long time, and it didn't really dawn on them the reality of it. But by 1952, they were beginning to say, hey, wait a minute, now this is going to cut right through the middle of our town. It's going to cut a swath through the middle of our town, take away people's property, and create a lot of noise. And so there was some concern that began to develop. We have some construction photos from the 1950s. These were not from 52, however. These are a bit later. But we show here how land taking was taking place, and how people began to think about in different terms about the highway. This is actually the building of what was then originally Exit 2 of the Mass Turnpike. So that's the same spot where the exit is today, and of course it's now known as Exit 10. They renumbered the exits a few years ago. And we also have over here a photo of the building of the Appalachian Trail footbridge that goes over the turnpike. And these would have been probably taken about 1955, but you kind of begin to get the idea that in 1952 people knew that this was going to bring change and that the turnpike would bring a lot of change. Right. We were talking a minute ago about the low costs of having a child and about how wages were low. It was a time of low wages, but look what you could buy. Here's some ads and some information about housing in Lee. You could buy a 7-room cottage in a central location, needing renovation, for only $6,000. And almost inconceivable today that you could buy a house that was livable, needed some work, but livable for $6,000. There was an old brick building in downtown Lee, 4,000 square feet for $2,500. Tyringham farmhouse, roomy with indoor plumbing and 8 acres, was only $12,000. And an East Lee stone hut, only 4 years old, could be had for $6,000. So you get an idea of how the economy was very modest size and prices were very low. You could get a cowboy suit at J.T. Owens Company, which is a department store that's in the building we now know as Zabian's building. And you could go to the theater for probably a quarter or something like that to see a movie on Main Street in Lee. Also during this era, the town was hit by Dutch elm disease, and the many elm trees that lined the streets of Lee were being killed by, spread by beetles, and they were being killed. So the town was kind of achieving a little bit barer look, where we didn't quite have the leafy streets that we had once had. Here are some pictures from downtown Lee in that particular era. This is a before and after from 1953. And these pictures are taken from newspapers.com. They originally appeared in the Berkshire Eagle. Okay, so what was going on in 1953? Well, Dr. Jonas Salk, who had invented the polio vaccine, to demonstrate its safety and effectiveness, administered it to himself and to his family. We also have the first climbing of Mount Everest. This is Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, the first climbers. Today it seems like there's a traffic jam up there where everybody wants to climb it. Well, not quite everybody, but a lot of people want to climb it. The Salk polio vaccine, many parents were paralyzed with fear by polio, the disease polio, and the Salk vaccine was welcomed. In fact, it was given as mass inoculations in the school. Not much questioning about whether it was safe or not, as we saw with COVID vaccines. But the Salk vaccine was welcomed by these people who had feared the death of their children or the crippling of their children from this dread disease. So in 1953 in Lee, what was going on? Well, we let get away something that might have been a great tourist attraction here in Lee, and that is a covered bridge. Many people today don't realize that we actually had 2 covered bridges at one time. And this particular one was on Meadow Street, just down near Oak and Spruce Resort. And it was a 104-year-old bridge in 1953. It was hit by a truck and damaged, and the town decided they wouldn't repair it. It was in kind of bad repair anyway. So the town fathers ruled that they were going to take the bridge out, and in cooperation with the state, they were going to put in a metal bridge, metal and concrete bridge. And the locals down there kind of got angry. They wanted to preserve the bridge. So the town went down and they dumped, they said the bridge was closed, and they dumped loads of sand at both ends of the bridge and said it was not to be used. And the locals went down and shoveled the sand out of the way and drove over the bridge anyway. But it was sagging in the middle. In fact, I think you can detect a little sag maybe in this picture. It was sagging in the middle, and it was done for. It was the end of an era after 104 years that all wooden bridge stood. It had no nails in it. It was all, we will see when you get to the display cases, it was held together by large pegs and no nails in the original bridge. So here we see pictures of the current bridge that's been there since 1953, and it's all rusting away, and the concrete is chipping away, and not nearly as durable as the old covered bridge, which was so popular with so many people, and so many people hated seeing it go. Prices, as I've been saying, very low in the 1950s. Here we have an ad for Lee's Supermarket. Young tom turkeys were 55 cents a pound. Young hens, 63 cents a pound. You could go to Thanksgiving dinner at the East Lee Inn and get a huge spread, all of this menu for $2.50 a piece. Television was making inroads in the 1950s, and many families had floor model television sets that were the picture was actually inside of a furniture box. They were nicely done furniture boxes. But television, of course, was black and white, and all the pictures were black and white at that time. And they had a problem with what was called vertical or horizontal hold. The picture would scramble, and it would turn either to a narrow band up and down or a narrow band sideways. But people took to, sometimes they'd stomp on the floor. There were no remote controls, but they'd stomp on the floor, and it would actually bring the picture back. Or they would walk over and whack the side of the box, and that would bring the picture back in. Pretty primitive television. There was only one channel advertising, that was WRGB in Schenectady, and it came on the air at 6 o'clock in the morning and went off at 12:45 at night. So there was no TV overnight, and it was pretty primitive, but TV was beginning to make inroads by 53. All right, 1954. The move along to 1954, a really interesting year. One of the biggest events of 1954 was the Brown versus Board of Education ruling on segregation in schools and segregation in general. The Supreme Court handed down this ruling in 54. It's yet to be fully implemented, actually, and there actually has been some backsliding on that, but as of 54, what formerly had been known as separate but equal was no longer considered to be legal, and things were about to change. We see with television coming in, we see a TV dinner up there, beans and franks in this case, a Swanson dinner. So families suddenly kind of left the dinner table, and they were eating dinner on little trays and sitting in front of TV sets and watching television. And a lot of people think that had a lot to do with the decline of family life. Families didn't have the conversations at the dinner table that they had once had. Also in 1953, the great fad of the year was coonskin hats. There was a program on television about Davy Crockett, the Western frontiersman, and played by Fess Parker, and so coonskin caps sold like hotcakes in 1954. Again, we see more about the toll road that was about to come in. We see that there was a meeting at the East Lee Inn where people could come and find out all about the toll road, and Perini Construction Company of Providence well, actually, of Framingham, the part of it that did this work received the contract to do the turnpike construction in our area rather. And this brings us to the building of motels in Lee, anticipation of a lot more tourist trade, and some of our motels that still exist. This is the Sunset Motel down here, which was built in 1940. No, pardon me, 1950 something, I'm not sure. So once again, looking at how the economy, the differences in the economy, and look at this. This is from Bob Nichols' super service station in Stockbridge. You go over there and buy a car. You could buy a car, a 48 Plymouth, an operational car, a Club Coupe for $350. Or if you wanted to really splurge, you could go with a 52 Buick special 4-door two-tone for $1,475. But very, very low prices, almost inconceivable in relation to the price of vehicles today. Lee wanted to get into the act as many of the surrounding towns had great tourist attractions, Tanglewood in Lenox and Stockbridge, Jacob's Pillow in Beckett. Lee wanted to get into the act, so some people in Lee began trying to plan a folk festival. They wanted to have a big, and this was not going to be just music, it was also going to be a lot of folk culture that they were going to bring in, folk foods and so on. They were looking to have a big celebration in Lee that would help to put Lee on the map a little bit more. And it never happened, actually. They needed a startup cost of about $10,000, and they were never able to raise that much money for it. So, and here we have a photo of local police officers, the chief of police receiving a gift, and the gift is a 20 gauge shotgun, which was presented as a riot control, for use in riot control. We had very few riots in Lee at that time, as far as I could determine, but anyway, they were prepared in case any should happen. So, and we threw into this space, this is actually comes a little bit later, but we threw in hula hoops because this is probably the biggest craze of the entire decade of the 1950s. The Wham-O Corporation that had brought back the hula hoop, actually there had been hoop toys for many, many years, probably since 500 BC, according to some sources. But Wham-O reintroduced the hula hoop, this hoop here, hoops of various sizes for different people. And the hula hoop brand in 1958, actually. And they sold about 25 million hoops in the first 4 months. So Wham-O Corporation did very well for itself. And little strange fad of the 1950s. All right, by 1955, I Love Lucy was still the #1 television show, but we put in the Jackie Gleason show, which was #2, and so that's a big part of the culture of the 50s. The book Lolita came out, quite scandalous at the time. Rosa Parks and the bus protests in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1955, and a big fad, Mickey Mouse ears. So that was the fad of 55. Also in 55, now going to Lee in 1955, we find that the district schools are still remain in Lee. Bus transportation of students had been around since about 1920. But by 1955, there were still a few of these little district schools around. East Lee had 2 grades, 1 and 2. Also 3, 4, and 5 in East Lee. South Lee had grades 1 through 6 rather. And East Lee had just 2 grades, 1 and 2. And everybody else was in consolidated schools downtown, all in the High Street location, which is now elderly housing. Lee was also a ski town. I think many people don't really realize that Lee was a ski town. We had a ski area at Beartown State Forest, basically behind the Willow Mill in South Lee, quite a substantial slope, 820-foot drop. And the state had contracted this out to private operators, and it was built mainly as a ski train facility. So ski trains came from New York. They would park in South Lee on the tracks down there. The train would be heated. It would have food. So people could go out and ski, and then they could come back to the train and buy food and warm themselves up, because there was not a lot of facilities at the ski area, but there was a lift. There were T-bar lifts that went up the hill. And some of that still remains. If you hike up in there, you can see remnants of the lifts that were there. And you can see in one photo here the large fireplace that was at the lodge, which was up on the hill. That area had little chance of remaining as a modern ski area because there was very little room for parking there. It's right behind the mill. And at the time the ski area closed in 1966, they had only 6 parking spaces available to them, and the ski trains were long gone. By the way, to come from New York and go skiing, the railroad charged only $2.50 for a trip from New York and a trip back. So it was quite a bargain, and that began during the Depression years in the 1930s, and it was quite a popular thing for a while. Now, by 1955, we're beginning to see the invasion of rock music, and one particular group that was memorable was Bill Haley and the Comets, one of the early ones that sang a song called Rock Around the Clock, and parents were kind of scandalized and worried about the influences on their children of this crazy new music that had come in. Milton Bass, writing in the Berkshire Eagle at that particular time, said that, predicted at that particular point in 55 that an outraged public would smother rock and roll. But Mr. Bass was changing his mind, and by 1957 he said rock and roll is here to stay. And he admitted in 1958 that he actually liked the music. He liked the bounce and the beat and the wailing saxophones. But there was a group of General Electric pensioners who had a band at the time, and they said they wouldn't play the music because it gave them headaches, and they stuck with waltzes and foxtrots. So, but the trendy music was kind of slow to reach Lee. It was being played nationally. It was a craze of popularity for it. But in 1955, in the Lee High School yearbook, the favorite band was the Guy Lombardo Orchestra, which had started in 1924. So that's a pretty outdated kind of band when you think of it. And even by 1960, the class of 1960 said its favorite band was the Glenn Miller Orchestra. Ironic, because Glenn Miller himself had been dead for 16 years at that particular point. The band was still playing, but Glenn Miller was gone, died in an airplane crash. This is a enlargement of the eastern end of the Massachusetts Turnpike in Lee. Once the road was built, they officially named it the Mass Pike. So Mass Pike was the official name. And if you look carefully at this picture, you will see that there are no cars on the road because the road wasn't open yet. And so that picture is probably from early 1957, possibly late 1956. But it shows much of East Lee. And what we did here was challenge people who come to the exhibit to look and see if they can find these 23 locations in East Lee and line them up to the correct places on the map. If they're not sure, they can come down here, and they've got a key that shows where all those places were located. So that's our huge new turnpike built, had a huge influence, and we'll talk a little bit more about that influence as we move along here. And we're giving many thank yous to CTSB, the Lee Library, the Berkshire Eagle, which has made its archives available to us through Berkshire's through newspapers.com, and talking also about other activities of the Lee Historical Society. This is me in 1950, as I was preparing to start high school. I'm in my basketball uniform from West Brookfield Junior High School. At the time, I was 14 years old. At the time, I'm now 87 and I no longer play basketball. We start with the year 1956. And who appears on the scene in 1956 with Heartbreak Hotel, the #1 hit song by Elvis himself, the king of rock and roll, and rock and roll music is ascendant in 1956. We also have the Federal Interstate Highway Act signed into law in 1956, and eventually the Mass Pike will be incorporated into that and designated as I-90, which it is today. We also have the retirement of Massachusetts' own Rocky Marciano, the only undefeated heavyweight champion in boxing history, and very popular in Massachusetts. He was from the city of Brockton, Massachusetts. So we move along to Lee in 1956. And we're reminded that the Route 20 in this era, before the opening of the Mass Turnpike, Route 20 was the main road between Boston and Albany. So all of the truck traffic was coming directly through Lee. And the town police force here was kept very busy dealing with accidents that took place, fatal accidents in many cases, people driving too fast through this little town, and especially east of here, going up through the hills, very dangerous. And we have a picture here of an accident, truck accident from 1957, actually, in the upper left-hand corner. And we have many other accidents that took place in the area. And those, it's just scratching the surface. It was practically every day of the week there were accidents here. So it's become a lot safer in our time. In this panel down below here, we see visiting dignitary John Kennedy, who was then a U.S. Senator and a rising star in politics, came to Lee in 1956. He's pictured here in the Lee courtroom. 4 years later, he would be elected President of the United States. And he was here to talk about flood control in 1956. We see law and order on a tight budget. The Lee police had a single police car. And the town has just appropriated $500 to finally equip it with a two-way radio in 1956. And Lee had been sort of a town with quite a bit of violent crime at one time in its early days, but by 1956 almost everything was concentrated on highway problems. There were just 157 arrests in Lee, none of them for violent crimes in 1956, and women were almost never arrested. There were only 12 arrests of women in that whole year of 1956. Mostly the crimes were drunkenness, motor vehicle offenses, and what we would consider to be fairly minor crimes. Again, we see the Lee Wildcats, the glorification of school sports. Lee has always been a town which has supported boys' sports very heavily, and as we said earlier, not so much for girls' sports. Right. 1957, we see a familiar face here for those of us who are old enough to remember. We see Ed Sullivan, whose show was number 2 at the time. The $64,000 question, a quiz program, was in the first place. And we also see flying saucers or frisbees, also a Wemo Corporation. The Wemo Corporation must have been making a heck of a lot of money because they had 2 of the biggest fads of the era, and these things sold like crazy. So this is a lighter moment from the 50s, the introduction of the frisbee. And more about the news events during the 1950s. South Vietnam was invaded by the Viet Cong in 57. That's a omen for the future of the American military as they would later go to fight in Vietnam. In Lee, during this era, the turnpike had actually become a reality. When they opened the turnpike, they offered free rides for X number of hours. I think it was about 6 hours or something like that. And as you can see in this picture, people trying to get on the highway, and they couldn't even get on the highway. There were so many people taking advantage of those free rides. And each of the rest areas along the Massachusetts had a Howard Johnson's, a sit-down restaurant. And even Howard Johnson's couldn't escape the controversies of the era because the state had ruled in its infinite wisdom that the rest areas, the businesses in the rest areas could not be taxed by the local towns. So the local towns said, oh, no taxes, then no emergency services on the road. We won't send our fire trucks up onto the road. We won't send our ambulances up on the road. So there was more than one way to bring equality into that fairness into that situation. We see a Mass Turnpike ticket, not too many years ago that those were discontinued. The original turnpike went just from West Stockbridge to Weston, Mass, at what was then Route 128, and the section into Boston was built later. But you could travel a significant distance on this high-speed road going east and west. Lee in 1957 was still a God-fearing town, as we say. There were 7 churches, all doing very well, all prosperous, all with big membership and big Sunday schools and that type of thing. So Lee was a very religious town, and it remained that way. Many people thought that Lee was going to grow dramatically with the Mass Turnpike. They thought it was going to bring in, the selectmen believed that the population of the town would at least double. Some people were predicting 12,000 as a population for Lee, but today it's only 5,700 or thereabouts. But if you go east and you look at the effects of the road, it was tremendous. The town of Framingham in the immediate area of Boston went from 28,000 people to 72,000 today. The town of Marlborough went from 15,000 to 40,000. The town of Westboro went from 7,000 to 21,000, while Lee, which was about 4,000 in 1957, 4,800 in 57, went to about 5,700 today. So there was not the growth that was anticipated in 1957 was really never achieved. But the town remained a very livable place, of course, as we know it to be today. All right, we go along to 1958, and we begin to see interesting developments in 58. We see the introduction of Ford's brand new, much ballyhooed car called the Edsel, and it was a complete flop, possibly or partly because people were looking at smaller vehicles at the time. The Edsel was a big, expansive vehicle. It is said that it was a well-built car and well-designed, but did not achieve popularity. You could have bought an Edsel in Lee at the time. There was a Ford dealer which was located near the turnpike. but few people purchased Edsels anywhere, and certainly not in Lee. We see the beginning of a folk music festival with the Kingston Trio singing a song that shot to the top of the charts almost immediately. Tom Dooley, hang down your head, Tom Dooley. And Tom Dooley was about to die in the song, so it's kind of a depressing piece of music. But people love folk music, and there was a folk music craze that went on for several years thereafter. It's kind of faded away now, but now in Lee during the 1950s, it seemed that good times were going to go on forever, and people weren't really looking ahead and saying, I wonder how long this can go on with very high pay in what was considered then to be very high pay in the paper industry, and the marble industry was kind of fading, but the quarries were still there for limestone. But as we say here, let the good times roll. It was good times, and everybody was looking forward to this continuing. But to give you an idea of the economy again of the era, the decade started with a new contract with Smith Paper and a 6-cent per hour raise, plus 3 weeks of vacation after 15 years. So the benefits were modest. As we have seen, prices were also very modest. And we will see more on that as we move along as well. So in the family finances in 1958, the average wage in the U.S. for men was $4,888, and for women, $3,078. And managers and officials, 5909. Boy, how that has changed. That has skyrocketed for managers and officials. And there certainly has been much gain in all kinds of industries. You see here a column by Frank McCarthy from the Berkshire Eagle, in which he's talking about the boom in the paper industry. Everybody was expecting that the paper industry would be here forever, even though the reasons why it was established here were no longer relevant. Eventually, the paper industry would go to its markets, and most of the paper industry. Fortunately, we still have Onyx Paper, and we love that particular company. A living wage, we see down below here, we got an idea of what people were being paid in Lee. The superintendent of schools was the highest paid public official, and he was getting $5,280 for a year. The superintendent of streets, $5,093. The police chief, $5,072, and so on, right down to lifeguards. All of the lifeguards at Sandy Beach were had for $1,039 for the summer. The dog officer received a mere $220 for, despite the prospect of being bitten while he was controlling the dogs. And you could get, if you brought in a wildcat, you could get a bounty of $20. So that's what people were being paid in Lee in the 1950s. We see down in the lower left-hand corner, I discovered this as I was in the process of researching the 1950s. Somebody came in on Canal Street with this 1958 DeSoto automobile with its big tail fins, typical of the 1950s. And that car is still parked down on, somebody's planning to restore it, I would assume. It's parked down on Canal Street in Lee. We see in this lower panel, again, referring to prices, we see the Owens department store offering their sports shirts at very low prices there. And we see the East Lee Inn offering all-you-can-eat seafood dinners for 99 cents. It's pretty amazing. You can't get much for 99 cents anymore. So, all right, we go along to the year 1959, and we find Cuba becoming a communist country under Fidel Castro. We see Vice President Nixon debating in the famous kitchen debate, debating Nikita Khrushchev, and we see Hawaii becoming the 50th state in 1959, and so lots of developments. The top TV show was Gunsmoke. Small cars began coming in. Here you see the 1959 Volkswagen Beetle, and the Lee Theater was still open. You could still watch the hit movies at the Lee Theater. Now we drop down here and we look at what was going on in Lee. Well, first we have Lee boy meets Lee girl, and that means that most of the marriages were between local people. Families intermarried considerably. It's kind of funny. Everybody seems to be related to everybody else in Lee, and so that's typified by 1959. There were 38 ceremonies performed, and 17 of them were between two residents of this town, and 18 more involve at least one participant from one of the other area towns in Berkshire County, and there were only, I think, 3 marriages on there that involved people from outside the area. So you didn't have very many people coming in from outside, despite the increased mobility of the society in this particular era. There's a popular book today called Bowling Alone that decries the decline of the social aspect of bowling, how bowling teams were so typical in towns like Lee. The scores were reported in the newspaper on a regular basis, and the standings, there were many, many teams. There were at least 18 men's bowling teams in 1960, 14 women's teams, and 6 teams in teenage leagues. And the bowling alleys originally in this era were right on Main Street. They were upstairs above what was then the Johansson 5 and 10 cent store. That's the last block next to the town hall. And I took a tour up there before that was renovated, and the bowling alleys were still there. But in 1959, they moved. New bowling alleys were built on Route 102, and they were down there for many years. That facility is also gone now. But this was a huge popular activity in the town among many people, and a huge socialization thing. I think television may be one thing that killed it. But if you want a good read the book Bowling Alone. Lee seemed to be bowling together in this particular era rather than bowling alone. Some of the younger people today, they think of this era as being very prudish, but oddly enough, nightlife was very popular, and some of this was pretty edgy, actually. Young people today may find it hard to believe that their grandparents enjoyed the baggy pants comics and exotic dancers at places like Showboat, which was in New Lebanon, New York. And there are also facilities of this type in Berkshire County, Lee Lanesborough Road, and Lee Cheshire Road, rather, which is Route 8. Had one of these, a place called Donlands. There were several of them around, and even places like the Crooked Lake Hotel. This is a New Year's Eve celebration there. And some of as I said, there were strippers. There was some pretty edgy stuff that went on in the Showboat, and folks in this era enjoyed it quite a bit. So we also see a change in shopping habits. Lee's Main Street takes a hit when the first discount store in Berkshire County arrives, and that would be Zayre, the Zayre store, which was built in 1960 in Pittsfield. And they're a big price cutter, of course, so some of the downtown stores find it very hard to compete. But here's ads for a couple of Lee's downtown stores at the time. The Army-Navy store, which would now be Ben's and is still open, actually, and Jack's Clothing, which was on Main Street in Lee, selling at very low prices but not able to compete with a discounter such as Zayre. So that's 1959. We included the year 1960 here, And some people may say, well, why did you do that? That's not a 1950s year. Well, there's some controversy about how years should actually be expressed in decades. Most people would say 1951 to 1960 was the decade of the 1950s. So we included both 1950 and 1960 so that there would be no debate about it, that we would have both years in here. So we see in 1960 some omens for the future. We see the OPEC organization, which has controlled oil supply at times and controlled oil prices quite effectively. We see protests at stores throughout the South and sometimes in the North even, in racial protests and racial unrest in the 50s as the people began to look to the Brown decision to be fully implemented. The number one hit song of the era, oddly enough, Percy Faith, an orchestra leader, had two of the number one hit songs in this era, and his was Theme from a Summer Place. That's from a movie theme. We see the beginning of what is now the New England Patriots. They were known as the Boston Patriots. They started with the American Football League in 1960, and we see the retirement of Red Sox legend Ted Williams from Boston. The biggest fad is the twist with Chubby Checker, or possibly Charles Atlas's Power Isotonics, and the number one TV show, Wagon Train, which starred John McIntyre and others. Now, the Lee had been involved, they began to see with some growth that was going on in the town, began to see crowding in the schools, and Lee was involved for probably the better part of a decade in discussions about regionalization of schools. Many of the area towns involved in these discussions, Lenox was involved, Stockbridge, West Stockbridge, even Otis and Sandusfield were involved in the discussions. And after a decade of debate on this subject, the committee finally decided that Lee would be better off building its own high school. So in 1960, with the town expanding and some new small developments coming in, we see the building of the new Lee High School. And this looks quite different from the old building, but the kids look different too, because here's a class of 1901 here, and here's some kids from the class of 1960. So actually, this is 1977, a little bit later, but people were changing, and the schools were changing too. So Lee built its own school, and interestingly, people were so convinced that building its own high school was the best option for Lee at that point that the vote was 354 to nothing at town meeting. Nobody opposed building a new high school, which costs more than $3 million to build. So it had become a consensus that this was the right path for people to go. Now we see ads, back to school ads. We see thermos bottles and lunch buckets, and we see typewriters, and these are kind of outdated things now. Kids don't even know what a typewriter is. And of course the lunch buckets have probably gone out to a large extent too. We also see a lot of concern in this era about aimless, reckless, restless youth. Concerns on the part of the town about the misbehavior of kids hanging around with very little to do. Remember, in the early history of this town, people were very busy working on farms, later working in mills, and by 1960, there's a lot of leisure time, and kids are hanging around, and there's a lot of concern about it. The pastor of the St. Mary's Church asking the PTO to organize after-school activities, referring to kids as unpredictable, babbling one minute, boasting the next, and very concerned about this, and also concerned about kids sneaking over the hill into New York State, where there was a lower drinking age, and getting served as drinks in New York State. Massachusetts drinking age was still 21. So we have a lot of information about the concern about kids at this particular point. The Little League was developed in this era. I thought this was funny that a Lee couple in 1953 went to the selectmen and they complained that their children were being, and these are their words, unreasonably beaten by a teacher. And I wondered, is there such a thing as reasonable beating? It doesn't seem like there would be, but a PTA survey showed that kids had a lot of confidence in their parents. 87% of kids rated their parents always fair and understanding. Interesting. And 5% said sometimes. So a very small percentage did not have confidence in their parents. But it's hard to believe that these wholesome-looking kids from the 1960s were actually feared somewhat by their parents. This is the police chief of Pittsfield warning of wholesale arrests because of the misbehavior of kids at this particular time. So the 60s had ushered in this era in which parents were very concerned about their kids, and the towns in particular were concerned about the behavior of children. All right. Well, Joe, we have some additional material in our display case here, some of which is on loan to us from local people, and some of this is from the Lee Historical Society collection. So I'll just run through the items that are here. Many people think of the 50s as being a great time to raise children, and here we have some of the, these are on loan to us from Ellen Whitaker, who is a member of our board. I think Ellen is pictured down here. She's a little waif there at that time. And we thought those were wonderful little, there's Ellen's little shoes from her youth, member of a local family, very proud of the town, and a great addition to our board of directors of the Lee Historical Society. Here's a graduation program from St. Mary's School in Lee from 1953. And we have some pictures of local politicians. This has gotten moved a little bit here, but this is Mr. Casey Turner, who was a member of the state legislature. And the man in the middle is Christian Herter, who was governor of Massachusetts. And on the left we have the state senator, very popular state senator of the time, Silvio Conti. In the upper picture, we have former Senator Edward Brooke of Massachusetts with Casey Turner, who was the local rep. And down here from the 1950s, we have several dignitaries, Senator Conti, Governor John Volpe, and Mr. Turner is in that picture as well. There's a couple of other state politicians there. These are breeding records from Highland Farm. Highland is a remarkable place for Jersey cattle. It is said that about 80% of the Jersey cattle in the United States have their origins at Highland Farm. And Mrs. Wild, who lived there, is responsible for all of these innovations. She knew every cow like they were members of the family, and quite a lady, Mrs. Wild. Magazines were very popular in the 1950s, and here we have a couple of examples. We have a Life magazine with Marilyn Monroe on the cover there, and we have a Saturday Evening Post. These were looked forward to very much. Remember, in the era before television, there was very little in the way of visual entertainment. Radio was popular, but of course you had to use your imagination on that. So people look forward to the arrival of these magazines in the mail as they were being published in the 1950s. We also have, in this display case, we have a Lee High School megaphone, which was used by the cheerleaders. We're not sure what year, but we think it could have been from the 1950s. It looks like it's a 1950-ish kind of thing. And we mentioned before that the covered bridge was held together by pegs. There's one of the pegs from the Lee covered bridge. That's about all that's left of it right there, as far as we know. And if you can imagine building that bridge in the 1850s with nothing but pegs, no nails. They didn't have any nails that they used. More pictures of the Summer Street location of what was known as Mandalay Resort. It had been the home of one of the Smiths. And then later it became Lee Academy, a school. And today, if you go to that property, the Open Door Church owns one of the buildings on that property, and the mansion formerly belonging to the Smiths is still there. This is the original menu of the Friendly Ice Cream, which served Lee for about 70 years in two different locations. And is the original menu, and you can see prices were pretty reasonable. You could get a big beef for 45 cents or a tuna sandwich for 35, and all their ice creams and stuff, very popular in Lee. There's a picture of the Lee Theater from the 1950s, perhaps. The movie showing was actually released in 1947. It was a very popular film starring James Stewart, and probably perhaps from the 1950s. Matchbook covers on loan to us from Mal Eckert, who's a past president of the Lee Historical Society. And we see some businesses that still remain and others that are long gone that had matchbook covers. And then we see some additional material from the Beartown ski area, a trail map from Beartown, a map of Beartown State Forest showing the locations of the ski area, and then the bylaws of a group which was for a local group, which was formed, local ski group, that actually proposed to use the area for local skiing. So, Joe, again, we thank you very much for coming today. And again, we repeat the thank you to the Lee Public Library, and especially to the Berkshire Eagle, which we use heavily. It's the newspaper record for Berkshire County, and we used it very heavily in creating this exhibit and looking at what happened in the 1950s. The exhibit will be on display here at the Lee Public Library throughout the month of August. We'll be taking it down August 31st, so if you want to come and relive the 1950s or learn about the 1950s, now's the time to do it at the Lee Public Library. And thank you very much to everyone.